Hi everyone, my name is Emma. The topic that I chose for my research paper is um, race and burnout. So I wanted to see kind of what research was out there about how race impacts feelings of burnout and kind of vice versa. Um, so I'm going to go through a PowerPoint just of what the findings that I had and kind of what those meant. Let's see. So the four topics that I covered in my paper. First, I outlined the definition of burnout. So using kind of a universal definition throughout my paper and establishing what that was, what it looks like in the field. So what are some of the behaviors of people who are experiencing burnout? What does that look like at work, with clients? And then in predictors of burnout, that's where I kind of dove into seeing if people of color experience burnout at a different rate than non-people of color. And then kind of discussed how that impacts social workers and how that impacts supervision. Um, so this definition of burnout that I found from a study done by Taylor and Milliar kind of breaks up the definition of burnout into three components. So there's emotional exhaustion that can be categorized as extreme mental or physical fatigue, cynicism, which looks like a detached response to workplace services, and then a reduced professional efficacy. So not being able to fully do the responsibilities of your job and complete the tasks that need to be completed. And then kind of a simpler definition that was from our textbook just defines burnout as a syndrome exhibited by workers dealing with intense stress over a period of time and lacking support. So kind of experiencing high levels of stress within a job, but not having either the adequate resources or kind of an adequate way to deal with those things. And then kind of going further, workplace stress is categorized in a few different ways as well. And I thought that that was important to discuss. What does it mean when someone says they're experiencing workplace stress? Are they stressed because they have too many things to do? Are they stressed because they don't have adequate support from their supervisor, from the administration of the agency or organization or company? And so this study kind of broke that down as well into three different components. So it could be either the work environment is really stressful. So you could work in a really noisy environment all day. You could work in an environment that maybe doesn't have good internet, doesn't have like office equipment. That could be a cause for workplace stress. Or it could also be a physiological response to a threatening or difficult aspect of work. And then that can be directly measured by cortisol levels in a person's body. So if they are operating at kind of a heightened response level, so if they're experiencing that kind of fight or flight response in situations all day long, that can be a cause for workplace stress as well. And then additionally, if you are kind of feeling like you're working so hard on something and then you're not getting that reward that you expected back, either in the form of recognition, in the form of compensation or a promotion, or maybe what you're doing and what you're working really hard at isn't achieving the goal that you envisioned. That can also cause workplace stress as well. So those three situations can all kind of precipitate burnout in the way that to experience burnout, you have to experience some kind of stress for a prolonged period of time. And so those are a couple examples of how different situations within the workplace can lead to burnout, and kind of just further builds on that definition of burnout, of experiencing prolonged workplace stress. And then as well, it is important to note that various types of stress are experienced in different forms of work, different fields of work. So, for example, a teacher is going to experience a different type of stress than a firefighter, and a doctor is going to experience a different type of stress than a businessman. So, taking all of those things into consideration, this definition just kind of encapsulates a broad kind of criteria that can be applicable to any workplace or work field. So taking it a step further, so what does it look like when someone is experiencing burnout or has experienced kind of that heightened level of stress? That can be seen in employee to employee relationships. It can be seen in especially employee to client relationships. And so the study talked about how if a person is experiencing the level of stress that's causing them to disengage from their clients, that could create additional demands for them. So someone who is chronically behind on their work is always going to have more work to do because they are behind. And so people who kind of put off dealing with situations or put off responding to emails or responding to client calls, they're always going to have additional demands and less resources and less kind of mental capacity to deal with those things because they're experiencing that heightened level of stress or burnout. And then further, kind of working directly with clients. This study done by Baker, Shafuli, Sixma, Bosveld, and Van Dierendank talks about how you can depersonalize a client. So I think this is especially applicable in social work where we're dealing with so many heavy things. Depersonalization can sometimes be used as a form of protection. But if someone is sharing something really personal with you and really heavy with you, and you're not giving them that empathetic response that we should be giving them, that could potentially lead to them reacting to that maybe in an escalated way, which then in turn just creates more stressful interactions and increases that workplace stress. And then Schulman as well talked about this in our book and kind of said, if you keep going fast enough, if you keep kind of putting those things off, you don't have to feel the pain. You don't have to think about the abuse that someone endured. You don't have to think about the violence that someone endured. And so again, that depersonalization can kind of act as that protective barrier. But it can also cause more stress in the end. So something that I thought about when I was researching was if all of these situations affect employees in their interactions with clients, could that be grounds for impairment? And taking a look at the Social Work Code of Ethics, this is the definition of an impaired social worker. So, and then highlights our responsibility as fellow social workers in responding to that. So if a social worker is impaired due to personal problems, psychosocial distress, substance abuse, or mental health difficulties, it's our obligation as social workers to address that with a colleague. And then if that doesn't address the problem adequately, then it lays out kind of the next steps to go to the employer, to the agency, to the NASW, licensing, things like that. But I thought it was interesting that it mentioned mental health difficulties. And I think that it could be argued that if a person is experiencing kind of that depersonalization, that cynicism, and that detachment, there could be some instances of secondary stress or vicarious trauma that are impairing a social worker. And I think it's important to look at that line of, is this normal workplace stress, or is this impairing me in dealing with clients? So here's kind of what I found for the impact of race on burnout. So Walcott and McQuigg found that 25% of African American women identified workplace racism as a stressor, 25% of Puerto Rican women, and 9.5% of Mexican or Mexican American women also identified workplace racism as a stressor. So thinking back to that definition of workplace stress, racism wasn't listed as a stressor. It wasn't listed as something that precipitates burnout, but this is something that women in general experience due to their race, and I think that that's important to look at in thinking about what different stressors impact different racial populations within an agency. And then as well, I think as social workers, we always kind of get it drilled into us, like self-care, self-care, self-care. And while this study didn't specifically focus on social workers, it did find that 69% of African American women don't engage in stress-reducing activities, whereas 52% of Anglo-American or white women don't, 38% of Mexican and Mexican American women don't, 31% of Puerto Rican women don't either. So I just thought it was really interesting that this study looked at workplace racism as a stressor, and then it also kind of described the experiences of ethnic minority women in the workplace, and talked about how managing staff was difficult for these women of ethnic minorities, and they experienced more insubordination than their white counterparts, and then also had a more difficult time trying to implement policies or work for change within an organization. And then as well, that insubordination, right, also created another stressor for these women, and created a tension in the workplace for them, which also can be another stressor. So another study that I found was done more recently. The last study was done in 1994. And so this study done by Travis and Thorpe Muscon was done just a couple years ago. And this was a big study that's funded by a lot of really popular companies today, such as like Abercrombie, AT&T, just like big household names, focusing on how to improve inclusivity in the workplace, how to help ethnic minorities really thrive in the workplace and be able to contribute everything that they have in the workplace. And so this talked about this really interesting concept called emotional tax, which they defined as the combination of feeling different from peers at work because of gender, race, and or ethnicity, and the effects on health, well-being, and ability to thrive at work. And so they also discussed this feeling of being highly on guard. So that's kind of going back to that heightened flight or fight response, that feeling of looking out for instances of racism, looking out for microaggressions or exclusion, and how that impacts their ability to function in the workplace. And so this study found that 58% of the people surveyed reported being highly on guard while at work. And then it broke it down into gender and race. So 51% of Asian women, 58% of Black women, 56% of Latinas, and then 52% of multiracial women also reported being highly on guard. And then Black men and Latinos, they also addressed as well. Those two groups specifically most frequently report being highly on guard. So something that really struck me was kind of the lack of research surrounding race in the workplace and the implications that that has. And this was across all fields of work. I wasn't searching specifically for social work or the field of social work, or even specific fields within social work. So these studies, like I said, are applicable to all fields of work, and I think are very important in looking at how to create environments where people of color can really, like I said, contribute all that they have, because this study also found that these same employees who are feeling like they have to be on guard at all times are also the same employees who want to thrive, who want to contribute all that they have to the organization, to the agency, to the company. And so if things aren't addressed within that agency, within that organization from a higher up level, these individuals are also at a higher risk of leaving the company, which any company to lose highly driven individuals is a big loss, and can be really discouraging to those people of color. And so I did this kind of as this broad idea of how race impacts burnout, if it makes a person more susceptible to burnout, if it makes a situation different for them to experience burnout. And then just kind of applied all of that to the field of social work and supervision in general, as this is a supervision class. So some of the things I found were that having a good relationship with one's supervisors can alleviate kind of that job stress. If there's an adequate way to deal with the stress, if there's an adequate way to talk about it and kind of process and receive feedback about different situations, that can be really, really helpful in kind of mitigating the effects of traditional workplace stress. And then so taking that into the multicultural discussion, our textbook talks about how the responsibility for initiating the conversation about intercultural practice is on the supervisor. And so individuals of color are less likely to bring up those kind of sensitive topics because they anticipate that conversation is going to go badly. And no one wants to have a conversation that's going to end badly. So I think it's a natural reaction to try to not have that conversation. But for effective practice, especially in supervision, or especially in social work, that conversation needs to be had. And our textbook did a really great job of laying out how to have that conversation in a way that's both respectful and efficient. And so thinking about kind of how different areas of work experience different stressors. That's also true within the field of social work. So in my paper, I talked about how a child welfare worker is going to have a very different experience and face very different stressors than someone working in hospice. A child welfare worker is going to come into contact with neglect, abuse, um, substance abuse, things like that, kind of day in and day out, and navigating that. Whereas someone working in hospice is going to be exposed to higher rates of death, kind of just all of the things that surround that. And then thinking about as well, supervisors in social work have a responsibility to make sure that the job is getting done that the employee needs to do, but also kind of managing the employee and the fact that the supervisor needs to make sure that the employee is not impaired, that they're not being impacted by job stress to a level that is ultimately going to be hurtful to the client. And so for me, this was really interesting because I think specifically for social work, in any field, there's so many stressors present. There's so many different populations that we deal with. And personally, I think that's stressful enough for me some days. And so thinking about a different set of stressors that's experienced by people of color, in addition to the stressors experienced as social workers, I think it's really, really vital to address that intersection, and specifically for supervisors to do that, to ensure that their employees are not impaired, that they are being heard, that they are just able to address those racial stressors in a safe environment, so that, less stress is experienced. So I think that definitely the impact of race on burnout is an area for further research, and then specifically how race impacts burnout within the field of social work is also another good field or another good area for future research. So hope you enjoyed my presentation and look forward to the feedback.